The howling wind rattled the shutters of Mason Northrop's ranch house as he stared into the dancing flames of his hearth, a glass of whiskey warming in his calloused palm. February 1884 had brought one of the worst blizzards Wyoming territory had seen in decades, the kind that buried fence posts and froze cattle where they stood. Outside his window, Wheatland disappeared beneath a relentless sheet of white, the world beyond his property line swallowed by winter's fury. Mason set down his glass and rose from his chair, stretching his tall frame. At 32, he'd built his modest cattle operation from nothing, surviving drought, rustlers, and the loneliness that came with choosing land over companionship. The fire popped and hissed as he pulled on his heavy coat, preparing for one final check on his livestock before turning in for the night. "Just a quick look," he muttered to himself, wrapping a thick wool scarf around his neck. "Make sure nothing's broken through." The moment Mason opened his door, the wind nearly knocked him backward. Snow drove sideways, stinging his exposed skin like needles as he forced himself forward. The barn stood just 50 yards from the house, but in this weather, it might as well have been miles. He lowered his head and pushed against the gale, following the guide rope he'd strung between buildings for exactly this purpose. The relief of reaching the barn was immediate. Mason secured the door behind him, shutting out the worst of the storm's fury. Lantern light cast long shadows across the interior as he moved down the center aisle, checking each stall. His horses nickered softly at his approach, steam rising from their nostrils in the cold air. "Everyone doing all right?" he asked, running a gloved hand along his favorite mare's neck. The animals seemed settled, which eased his mind. Mason continued his rounds, making his way toward the back of the barn where he stored extra hay. That's when he saw her. Curled in the corner of the hay storage area lay the unmistakable form of a human being, wrapped in a threadbare coat, half covered in loose straw. For a moment, Mason thought he might be looking at a corpse, someone who'd sought shelter and succumbed to the cold, but then he noticed the slight rise and fall of breathing. "Hey," he called, approaching cautiously. "Hey there." The figure didn't stir. Mason crouched down, setting his lantern beside him. It was a woman, her face partially obscured by a tangled mass of auburn hair. Ice crystals clung to her eyelashes and the collar of her coat. Her lips held a concerning bluish tint. "Madam," Mason said more forcefully, touching her shoulder. "You can't stay here. Wake up." When she remained unresponsive, alarm shot through him. Mason shook her more vigorously, relief washing over him when she finally let out a soft groan. Her eyelids fluttered open, revealing eyes the color of summer sage, disoriented and unfocused. "Wah," she mumbled, trying to pull away from his touch. "You're in my barn," Mason explained, keeping his voice steady. "In the middle of a blizzard. You need to get somewhere warm." The woman stared at him, comprehension slowly dawning across her features. She attempted to sit up, wincing with the effort. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice barely audible. I just needed shelter. Can you walk?" Mason asked, already calculating what he needed to do. She looked half frozen, and the temperature in the barn, while better than outside, wasn't sufficient to fully warm someone in her condition. She nodded weakly, but when she tried to stand, her legs buckled beneath her. Mason caught her before she hit the ground. "I've got you," he said, decision made. In one smooth motion, he lifted her into his arms. She weighed less than he expected, like a bird with hollow bones. "I'm taking you to my house. It's not far." "My bag," she protested faintly, gesturing toward a small leather satchel half hidden in the hay. Mason scooped it up and handed it to her. "Hold on to this, and hold on to me. The wind's fierce out there." She didn't argue, clutching her bag to her chest with one hand and wrapping the other around his neck. Mason blew out the lantern and steeled himself for the journey back to the house. The moment he opened the barn door, the storm enveloped them. He felt the woman bury her face against his shoulder as he battled forward, one hand gripping the guide rope, the other supporting her weight. The 50 yards felt like a mile, but eventually, Mason shouldered his way through his front door. The warmth of the house enveloped them immediately, the fire still crackling in the hearth. He gently set the woman down on the sofa nearest the flames. "Thank you," she managed, teeth chattering violently. Mason didn't waste time with pleasantries. "Those clothes are damp. You need to get out of them." He moved to a trunk in the corner of the room, retrieving a flannel shirt and woolen trousers that would be much too large for her but dry at least. "These will have to do. I'll turn around." He placed the clothes beside her and politely faced the wall. Behind him, he could hear the rustle of fabric, punctuated by sharp intakes of breath that suggested pain or extreme cold, likely both. "I'm decent," she finally said. Mason turned to find her swimming in his clothing, the sleeves rolled up multiple times to free her hands. Her wet garments lay in a heap on the floor. The color had begun returning to her face, which now that he could see it properly, showed signs of both beauty and hardship. She wasn't young, mid-20s at least, with a dusting of freckles across her nose and a small scar near her right temple. "I'll make some coffee," he said, moving to the kitchen area. "Strong and hot, it'll help." While the coffee brewed on the stove, Mason retrieved extra blankets and draped them around the woman's shoulders. "I'm Mason Northrop," he offered. "This is my ranch." She clutched the blankets tighter. "Cora," she replied after a moment's hesitation. "Cora O'Malley." "Well, Miss O'Malley, what brings you to my barn in the middle of the worst blizzard in 10 years? Her eyes dropped to her lap. "Bad luck, mostly," she admitted. "I was on the stagecoach to Cheyenne when the weather turned. The driver said we couldn't continue. Everyone else had connections in town, but I." She trailed off. "So you wandered through the storm until you found my barn," Mason pressed, bringing her a steaming mug. Cora accepted the coffee gratefully, wrapping her slender fingers around the cup. "The driver pointed me toward Wheatland, said it was just a few miles. But the snow got so thick, I couldn't see the road anymore. I just kept walking, hoping to find shelter before I froze." She took a cautious sip. "Your barn appeared like an answer to prayer." Mason settled into a chair across from her. There was more to her story. He could sense it in the careful way she spoke, the things she wasn't saying, but he wouldn't press. "Not tonight." "You're welcome to stay until the storm passes," he said. "It might be a day or two." "The spare room is small but comfortable." Relief washed over her face. "I can pay," she said quickly, reaching for her satchel. Mason raised a hand. "That won't be necessary. I wouldn't turn anyone away in this weather, payment or not." "I insist on earning my keep somehow," she countered. "I can cook, clean, we'll figure that out tomorrow," Mason interrupted gently. "For now, just get warm and rest." As if on cue, Cora stifled a yawn. Mason showed her to the small bedroom off the main living area, a plain space with a narrow bed, a chest of drawers, and little else. "It's not much," he apologized. "It's perfect," she said sincerely. "Thank you, Mr. Northrop." "Mason," he corrected. "Sleep well, Miss O'Malley." "Cora," she replied with a small smile, the first he'd seen from her. Something in his chest shifted at the sight of it, a sensation he couldn't quite name. "Good night, Cora," he said, closing the door softly behind him. That night, as Mason lay in his own bed listening to the storm rage outside, he found himself wondering about the mysterious woman sleeping under his roof. Where had she come from? Where was she going? And why did a woman travel alone in such treacherous conditions? Sleep came fitfully. interrupted by the howling wind and the unsettling feeling that his orderly life had just been irrevocably changed. Morning arrived with eerie silence. Mason woke to find the storm had finally passed, leaving behind a world transformed by snow. Drifts rose higher than the windowsills, and the landscape stretched unblemished to the horizon, a blank page waiting to be written upon. The smell of coffee and frying bacon drew him to the kitchen, where he found Cora already awake, tending to breakfast on the stove. She'd found an apron hanging on a hook and wore it over his two large clothes, her hair neatly braided down her back. "Good morning," she greeted him cheerfully. "I hope you don't mind. I wanted to make myself useful." "Not at all," Mason replied, surprised by the domestic scene before him. It had been years since anyone but himself had cooked in this kitchen. "The snow's stopped," Cora observed, nodding toward the window, "but it looks like quite a lot fell." Mason poured himself coffee. "It'll be days before the roads are passable again. We're snowed in for now." If this news troubled her, Cora didn't show it. "Then it's fortunate I can cook," she said lightly, sliding eggs onto plates. "Though I should warn you, I'm much better with pastry than protein." They ate at Mason's small table, the silence between them comfortable rather than strained. In the light of day, Mason could better assess his unexpected guest. The warmth had fully returned to her complexion, highlighting the sprinkling of freckles across her cheeks and nose. Her eyes, which he'd thought green last night, revealed flecks of gold in the morning sun. Despite the borrowed clothes and circumstances, she carried herself with quiet dignity. "Your clothes should be dry," Mason said after breakfast. "I hung them by the fire last night." "Thank you," Cora replied, gathering their empty plates, "though I'll need to mend the coat. It was already falling apart before my journey, and now it's practically in tatters." "I have a sewing kit," Mason offered. "Not much, but the basics." After cleaning up breakfast, Cora set about repairing her coat, her fingers working deftly with needle and thread. Mason found tasks to occupy himself stoking the fire, checking his ledgers, but his attention kept drifting to his guest. "You mentioned heading to Cheyenne," he said eventually. "Family there?" Cora kept her eyes on her stitching. "No, just opportunity. I've been working as a school teacher in Missouri, but the position ended. I heard Cheyenne is growing and thought there might be work." "You're a teacher?" Mason asked, genuinely interested. She nodded. "For 6 years now. I started young." "Wheatland could use a good teacher," he said thoughtfully. "The last one left after 2 months, said the children were too wild and the winters too harsh." "Both sound like challenges I'm familiar with," Cora replied with a small smile. She tied off her thread and examined her handiwork. "There. Not pretty, but it will hold." Mason watched as she folded the mended coat carefully. There was a story there in the precise way she moved, in the guarded look that occasionally crossed her face, but he didn't pry. Everyone in the West carried secrets, himself included. "I need to check the animals," he said, rising from his chair. "Would you like to come along? The fresh air might do you good, and the path to the barn should be manageable." Cora's face brightened. "I'd love that. I've been cooped up for too long." They bundled up against the cold, Mason lending Cora an extra scarf and a pair of gloves that swallowed her hands. Outside, the world sparkled under a brilliant blue sky, the snow reflecting sunlight like millions of tiny diamonds. Their breath formed clouds in the frigid air as Mason led the way, breaking trail to the barn. Inside, the animals greeted them with soft nickering. Mason moved efficiently through his chores, feeding and watering while Cora watched with interest. "Have you always been a rancher?" she asked, stroking the nose of a curious mare who'd approached her. Mason forked hay into a stall. "No. I came west after the war after Appomattox. Tried mining first, then drove cattle, saved every penny." Bought this place 7 years ago. You fought in the war." Cora's expression softened with sympathy. Mason nodded, not elaborating. Those were memories he kept carefully boxed away, like artifacts too painful to display. "It seems like you've built something good here," she observed, changing the subject gracefully. "I manage," Mason replied. "It's not a big spread, but it's mine. Free and clear." They worked together to complete the chores, falling into an easy rhythm despite being strangers. Cora proved capable and unafraid of dirt or hard work, qualities Mason respected. By the time they returned to the house, cheeks flushed from exertion and cold, something had shifted between them, a tentative bridge spanning the gap of unfamiliarity. The day passed quietly. Cora found a book on Mason's modest shelf and settled by the fire to read. Mason caught up on mending tack and planning spring planting, tasks he usually saved for bad weather. Occasionally, they'd exchange observations or questions, getting to know each other in small increments. That evening, Cora insisted on cooking dinner, creating a surprisingly flavorful stew from Mason's limited pantry supplies. They ate by lantern light, sharing stories from safer territories of their pasts. Mason spoke of his travels across the West before settling in Wyoming. Cora described growing up with 4 brothers in a small Illinois town, learning to hold her own among rowdy boys. "Is that where your family is now? Illinois?" Mason asked as they finished their meal. A shadow crossed Cora's face. "My parents are gone. My brothers scattered after the war. 2 never came home from it." "I'm sorry," Mason said, recognizing the familiar shape of loss. Cora offered a sad smile. "It was a long time ago. We all carry our burdens, don't we?" The question hung in the air between them, an invitation Mason wasn't ready to accept. He stood and began clearing the table, using movement to deflect from deeper conversation. Later, as they prepared to retire for the night, Cora paused at her bedroom door. "Thank you again, Mason, not just for the shelter, but for your kindness." Something in her voice, in the genuine gratitude of her expression, stirred that unnamed feeling in Mason's chest again. "You're welcome, Cora. Good night." That night, Mason dreamed of battlefields transformed into endless snow, and a woman with auburn hair walking through the white expanse, leaving no footprints behind. The next morning brought warmer temperatures, the first hint that the brutal cold snap might be breaking. After breakfast, Mason ventured further from the house, checking fence lines and assessing damage from the storm. He returned mid-afternoon to find Cora in the midst of cleaning, the main room already transformed by her attention. "You didn't have to do this," he said, stamping snow from his boots at the door. Cora looked up from polishing the stove. "I wanted to. Idle hands make me nervous." She straightened, tucking a loose strand of hair behind her ear. "Besides, I found something interesting." She crossed to the sideboard and retrieved a dusty bundle wrapped in cloth. Carefully, she unwrapped it to reveal a chess set, the pieces carved from wood in simple but distinctive shapes. "It was on the top shelf, behind some old tins," she explained. "Do you play?" Mason hadn't seen the set in years. "My father taught me, but it's been a long time." "Would you like a game after dinner?" Cora asked. "I'm rather good, I should warn you. One benefit of having scholarly brothers." The challenge in her eyes, playful and warm, was impossible to resist. "You're on," Mason agreed, surprised by his own eagerness. That evening, after a simple dinner, they set up the chessboard on the small table between them. The familiar ritual of arranging pieces brought back memories of quiet evenings with his father before the war had taken him, like it had taken so much else. Cora proved true to her word. She played with a strategic mind and fierce determination that belied her gentle appearance. Mason found himself thoroughly engaged, planning moves several steps ahead, trying to anticipate her strategy. "Check," she announced triumphantly, after nearly an hour of play. Mason studied the board, seeing his defeat approaching but not quite upon him. "Not checkmate yet," he countered, moving his king to safer ground. Cora smiled. "Not yet, but soon." She studied his face rather than the board. "You're enjoying this." It wasn't a question, but Mason answered anyway. "I am, more than I expected to." "When was the last time you played with someone?" she asked, making her next move with deliberate care. Mason considered the question. "Must be 8 years now. There was a storekeeper in Laramie who kept a board in his shop." "And before that, my father," Mason replied quietly. "He loved the game, said it taught patience and consequence." Cora nodded thoughtfully. "Sound lessons. My father said something similar, though he never had the patience himself." She captured Mason's bishop. "Your move." The game continued, conversation flowing between moves, comfortable and unforced. Eventually, Cora maneuvered Mason into checkmate, her victory clean and well-earned. "Well played," Mason conceded, genuinely impressed. "Another round tomorrow." "I'd like that," Cora agreed, helping to pack away the pieces. Their fingers brushed as they worked, a momentary contact that left Mason unusually aware of her presence. As they prepared for bed, Mason found himself reluctant to end the evening. It had been so long since he'd enjoyed simple companionship, the easy back and forth of conversation with someone who challenged his mind. "The weather's warming," he noted, looking out the window at the clear night sky. "The snow will start melting soon. Roads might be passable in a few days." Cora's expression flickered with something disappointment, perhaps, before settling into a neutral smile. "Yes, I suppose they will." "No rush," Mason added quickly. "You're welcome to stay until you're ready to move on." "Thank you," she said softly. "Good night, Mason." "Good night, Cora." 3 more days passed in similar fashion. During daylight hours, they worked separately or together on various tasks around the ranch. Mason discovered that Cora had a natural way with animals, gentle but confident. She helped tend the horses and even assisted when a pregnant cow showed signs of distress, holding the lantern steady while Mason eased the breech calf into the world. "That was incredible," she breathed, watching the newborn heifer take its first wobbling steps. "I've never seen anything like it." Mason, wiping his hands on a rag, smiled at her wonder. Life finding its way even in the dead of winter. Each evening they played chess, taking turns winning games that grew increasingly competitive as they learned each other's strategies. Between moves, they shared more pieces of themselves. Mason described his dreams for the ranch, expanding his herd, eventually building a larger house. Cora spoke of her passion for teaching, the satisfaction of watching young minds grasp new ideas. But for all their growing ease together, Mason sensed Cora still held something back. Occasionally, he'd notice her staring into the distance, a troubled expression clouding her features. When he'd ask what was wrong, she'd smile it away, redirecting the conversation. On the morning of the 5th day, the sound of approaching horses broke the peaceful quiet of the ranch. Mason stepped onto the porch to find Sheriff Thomas Wilson and his deputy riding up the long drive, their horses laboring through the diminishing but still significant snow. "Morning, Mason," the sheriff called, tipping his hat as he dismounted. "Checking on folks after the storm." "Everyone all right out here?" "We're fine, Tom," Mason replied, noticing how the sheriff's eyebrows raised at his use of "we." "Lost a couple calves to the cold, but otherwise no damage." The sheriff nodded, stamping his feet to restore circulation. "Mind if we warm up a bit before heading back to town?" "Come on in," Mason invited, opening the door wider. Inside, Cora was setting the table for breakfast. She froze momentarily at the sight of the lawman, her face paling slightly before she recovered her composure. "Sheriff Deputy, this is Cora O'Malley," Mason introduced. "Miss O'Malley was caught in the storm and has been waiting out the weather here." "Madam," the sheriff acknowledged, removing his hat. "Fortunate you found shelter. That was a killer storm." "Yes," Cora agreed quietly. "Very fortunate." Mason offered the men coffee, which they gratefully accepted. As they warmed themselves by the fire, the deputy pulled a folded paper from his coat. "Almost forgot," he said. "Got some notices to distribute. Been a string of thefts over in Cheyenne and Fort Collins. Folks should keep an eye out." He handed the paper to Mason. Mason scanned the notice, which described several robberies at general stores and one at a bank. The culprits were believed to be a gang of 3 men and possibly a woman, though descriptions were vague. "Haven't seen any strangers," Mason said, handing the notice back. "But I'll keep watch." From the corner of his eye, he noticed Cora's hands trembling slightly as she poured coffee. The sheriff noticed too, his gaze lingering on her with professional interest. "You said you were heading to Cheyenne, Miss O'Malley?" he asked casually. "Yes," she answered, her voice steady despite her apparent nervousness. "For teaching opportunities." Interesting timing," the sheriff mused. "Roads should be clear enough by tomorrow if you're eager to continue your journey." "Thank you for the information," Cora replied politely. The lawmen didn't stay long. After warming themselves and exchanging news about other ranches in the area, they prepared to leave. At the door, the sheriff pulled Mason aside. "Just be careful, Mason," he said quietly. "Don't know much about your house guest, but these are uncertain times." "She's a school teacher, Tom," Mason replied, slightly defensive. "Hardly dangerous," the sheriff shrugged. "Just saying." "Keep your eyes open." After the lawman departed, an uncomfortable silence fell between Mason and Cora. She moved around the kitchen with nervous energy, avoiding his gaze. "Is everything all right?" Mason finally asked. Cora set down the plate she was holding with deliberate care. "Yes, of course." "Just surprised by the visitors." Mason studied her, remembering the way she'd reacted to the wanted notice. "Cora, if there's something troubling you, there isn't," she interrupted quickly, too quickly. Then, softening her tone, "Truly, Mason, I'm fine." But that evening, the easy companionship of previous days had vanished, replaced by a strained atmosphere that neither could fully dispel. They played chess as usual, but Cora's moves were distracted, her mind clearly elsewhere. She excused herself early, claiming fatigue. Later that night, Mason woke to the sound of movement in the main room. He rose silently, years of frontier living having taught him caution. Through his partially open door, he could see Cora fully dressed, gathering her meager belongings into her satchel. "Going somewhere?" he asked quietly, stepping into the room. Cora startled, nearly dropping her bag. I thought I should get an early start," she said, the lie transparent in her voice. "In the middle of the night, without saying goodbye." Mason moved closer, concern rather than anger driving him. "Cora, what's happening? Does it have something to do with that wanted notice?" She looked away, her shoulders sagging slightly. "You've been kind to me, Mason, kinder than anyone has been in a long time. That's why I can't stay." "That doesn't make any sense," Mason countered, gesturing for her to sit. After a moment's hesitation, she did, perching on the edge of the sofa like a bird ready to take flight. "Are you in some kind of trouble?" he pressed gently. Cora's hands twisted in her lap. "Not in the way you're thinking," she said quietly. "I'm not a thief or an outlaw." "Then help me understand." She took a deep breath, as if gathering courage. "I was engaged to be married," she began, her voice barely above a whisper, "to a man named Edward Blackburn. He seemed kind, respectable, the son of a local businessman in the town where I taught. But after we were engaged, I discovered he was involved in Unsavory activities. Loan sharking protection rackets. He and his brothers. Mason listened silently, giving her space to continue. When I confronted him, told him I couldn't marry a man who profited from others' misfortune, She touched the small scar near her temple. He showed me a different side of himself, said no one left a Blackburn at the altar. Anger rose in Mason's chest at the thought of someone striking her. So you ran, Cora nodded. I left everything behind. My position, my home, what little family I had nearby. I've been moving west ever since, staying ahead of them. Edward swore he'd find me. And you think he's still looking? The sheriff's notice, Cora explained. A gang of 3 men and possibly a woman. It could be Edward and his brothers. The timing of the thefts matches my journey west. She looked up at Mason, eyes glistening with unshed tears. I can't stay here. If they track me to your ranch, you'd be in danger too. Mason considered her story, finding no reason to doubt it. It explained her wariness, her reluctance to share details about her past, the fear that had seized her at the sight of the lawmen. Where will you go? He asked. Further west, I suppose. Oregon maybe, or California. Alone, in winter. Cora smiled sadly. I've managed this far. Mason stood and paced the room, considering options. There's another way, he said finally. Stay here. I told you I can't put you at risk. Hear me out, Mason interrupted. If these men are looking for Cora O'Malley, a single woman traveling alone, they won't be looking for Mrs. Northrop of Wheatland, Wyoming. Cora stared at him, confusion giving way to understanding. You're suggesting marriage, Mason confirmed, surprising himself with the certainty in his voice. A practical arrangement. You'd have protection, a home, a place to teach if you wish. Wheatland needs a school teacher, like I said. And what would you get from this arrangement? Cora asked cautiously. Mason considered the question. Company, he said honestly. Someone to share the work and the rewards. This place can be mighty lonely sometimes. You hardly know me, she pointed out. I know enough, Mason countered. I know you're hard-working and intelligent, kind to animals. Unafraid of difficulties. He paused. And I enjoy your company, Cora, more than I've enjoyed anyone's in a very long time. The fire crackled in the hearth, the only sound as Cora weighed his proposition. It wouldn't be a real marriage, she said finally. It would be whatever we choose to make it, Mason replied. We could start as partners, see where time leads us. Cora stood and walked to the window, staring out at the moonlit snow. You do this for a stranger. Take on her troubles as your own. You're not a stranger anymore, Mason said simply. And everyone deserves a chance to stop running. She turned to face him, studying his expression as if searching for hidden motives. Finding none, she asked softly, when would this happen, this marriage? As soon as the road's clear enough to reach town, a few days at most. Mason maintained a respectful distance, not wanting to pressure her. You'd have the spare room, of course, your own space. Cora's lips curved in a small smile. Ever the gentleman. Is that a yes? She took a deep breath. It's a yes, she said, her voice growing stronger with the decision. A practical arrangement, as you said. Mason felt a weight lift from his shoulders, though he hadn't realized he'd been carrying it. Then you should get some sleep, Miss O'Malley. Morning comes early on a ranch. As Cora returned to her room, Mason remained by the fire, pondering the unexpected turn his life had taken. What had begun as an act of basic human kindness, sheltering a stranger from a storm, had somehow transformed into something far more significant. He should have felt apprehensive about the commitment he'd just made, but instead, he felt only certainty. The roads to town cleared 3 days later. Mason and Cora rode into Wheatland together, her seated behind him on his steadiest gelding. The townspeople they passed regarded them with curious glances, unaccustomed to seeing the solitary rancher in female company. Judge Parker performed the ceremony in his small office, with the sheriff and his wife serving as witnesses. The vows were traditional, spoken clearly by both parties, though the circumstances were anything but conventional. When Mason slipped a simple gold band onto Cora's finger, his mother's ring, preserved all these years, the solemnity of the moment struck him with unexpected force. "You may kiss your bride," Judge Parker prompted after pronouncing them husband and wife. Mason hesitated, aware of their audience and the newness between them. But Cora rose slightly on her toes and pressed her lips to his, a brief, chaste kiss that nonetheless sent warmth spreading through his chest. "Congratulations, Mrs. Northrop," the sheriff said, the skepticism from his earlier visit replaced with genuine goodwill. "And welcome to Wheatland." On the ride back to the ranch, their ranch now, Cora sat closer behind Mason, her arms wrapped securely around his waist. The gold band on her finger caught the afternoon sunlight, flashing like a signal fire. "Are you having regrets?" Mason asked over his shoulder when they'd ridden in silence for several miles. "No," Cora replied honestly. "Are you?" "Not a single one." The winter days began to lengthen almost imperceptibly, minutes of daylight added like pennies saved in a jar. Mason and Cora settled into a rhythm together, dividing tasks according to skill and preference. She proved adept at household management, bringing order to spaces Mason had neglected for years. He taught her about ranching, the cycles of breeding and birthing, the constant vigilance required to keep livestock healthy through harsh Wyoming winters. In town, they presented a united front. Cora was introduced as Mason's new wife, a schoolteacher from back east who'd captured the heart of Wheatland's most confirmed bachelor. If anyone thought the match sudden or unusual, they kept such opinions to themselves. Wyoming territory, with its harsh climate and vast distances, bred pragmatic acceptance of unusual arrangements. Cora met with the town council about the vacant teaching position, impressing them with her credentials and quiet confidence. She was hired to begin when the new school term started in spring, with a modest salary that would contribute to their household. At home, they maintained the boundaries of their arrangement. Cora kept the spare room, Mason his own. They shared meals, conversation, and evening chess games that grew increasingly competitive as they learned each other's strategies. If sometimes their hands lingered when passing dishes, or their eyes held contact a moment longer than necessary, neither acknowledged it aloud. "I received a letter from Mrs. Wilson today," Cora mentioned one evening in late February as they sat by the fire after dinner. The sheriff's wife had taken Cora under her wing, introducing her to the other women in town. "There's to be a social at the church next weekend, to welcome spring." "Seems optimistic," Mason commented, glancing at the window where frost still etched intricate patterns on the glass. "Spring's a ways off yet." "Perhaps it's aspirational," Cora suggested with a smile. "She says everyone will be there, that we should attend." Mason set down the bridle he was mending. "Would you like to go?" "I would," Cora admitted. "It would be nice to meet more people before I start teaching, but only if you're comfortable with it." Mason couldn't remember the last time he'd attended a town social. Such gatherings had seemed pointless for a man alone, more reminder of what he lacked than source of enjoyment. But now, with Cora, the prospect held appeal. "Then we'll go," he decided. The night of the social arrived clear and cold, stars pricking the velvety darkness above as Mason drove their wagon into town. Cora sat beside him, wrapped in her mended coat with one of Mason's scarves adding extra warmth. In the weeks since her arrival, her face had filled out slightly, the haunted look in her eyes gradually fading. The church basement hummed with activity tables laden with food, a small group of musicians tuning instruments in the corner, townsfolk mingling in their Sunday best. Mason felt a momentary awkwardness as they entered, unused to such gatherings, but Cora's hand on his arm steadied him. "Mason Northrop, is that you?" boomed a friendly voice. Walter Jenkins, who owned the general store, approached with his wife. "Hardly recognized you without dust on your boots." "Hello, Walt," Mason greeted, shaking the man's hand. "Mrs. Jenkins, allow me to introduce my wife, Cora." "The new school teacher," Mrs. Jenkins said warmly, taking Cora's hands in hers. "We're so pleased to have you in Wheatland, my dear. The children have been running absolutely wild since Miss Abernathy left." "I look forward to meeting them," Cora replied sincerely. The evening progressed pleasantly, with introductions and conversations flowing more easily than Mason had anticipated. Cora charmed everyone she met, her genuine interest in the community evident in her questions and attentive listening. Mason found himself watching her with growing admiration, seeing her through the eyes of his neighbors, capable, intelligent, and unexpectedly beautiful in the warm lamplight. When the musicians began playing in earnest, couples took to the small dance floor. Mason hesitated, uncertain if Cora would want to participate in this part of the evening. "Would you care to dance?" he asked finally, offering his hand. Surprise flickered across her face, followed by pleasure. "I'd love to." Mason led her to the floor, placing one hand respectfully at her waist, taking her hand with the other. It had been years since he danced, but his body remembered the steps, guiding Cora in a simple waltz. "You dance well," she observed, following his lead with natural grace. "My mother insisted I learn," Mason explained. "Said a gentleman should know how to move across a dance floor without trampling his partner." Cora laughed, the sound bright against the music. "Wise woman, your mother." As they turned, Mason became increasingly aware of Cora's proximity, the subtle scent of soap in her hair, the warmth of her hand in his, the way her eyes reflected the lamplight. Something shifted in his chest, a recognition of feelings he'd been carefully containing since she'd first agreed to their arrangement. The music ended, but they remained standing close, the moment stretching between them like spun sugar. Then someone called Cora's name, breaking the spell. She stepped back, color high in her cheeks. "Mrs. Wilson wants to introduce me to someone," she said, a slight breathlessness in her voice. "I'll be right back." Mason watched her move away, a strange mixture of emotions churning inside him. The practical arrangement he'd proposed was becoming increasingly complicated by feelings that were anything but practical. Later that night, as they drove home under a canopy of stars, comfortable silence enveloped them. Cora leaned slightly against Mason's shoulder, whether from tiredness or choice, he couldn't tell. "Thank you for tonight," she said softly. "I haven't enjoyed myself like that in a very long time." Mason glanced down at her upturned face, moonlight silvering her features. "Neither have I," he admitted. The urge to kiss her was sudden and overwhelming, but he held back, uncertain of her feelings, unwilling to pressure her in any way. Instead, he returned his attention to the road, acutely aware of her warmth against his side and the complicated nature of the bond forming between them. Spring arrived with its usual Wyoming temperament, fitful and unpredictable. One day might bring sunshine and the first green shoots pushing through thawing earth. The next, a biting wind that made winter seem far from finished. Through it all, life on the ranch continued its steady rhythm, now enriched by the partnership that had developed between Mason and Cora. Cora began teaching at the small schoolhouse in town, riding in 3 days a week on a gentle mare Mason had trained specifically for her. The children, ranging from 6 to 16 years old, quickly responded to her firm but kind approach. Even the most recalcitrant boys, who had driven the previous teacher to tears and resignation, found themselves caught up in her enthusiasm for learning. James Elliot actually raised his hand today, Cora reported one evening, her face animated as she described her day. Answered a question about fractions without being prompted. The same James who put a snake in Miss Abernathy's desk, Mason asked, impressed. Cora nodded, laying out supper on the table. The very same. Turns out he has quite a mind for mathematics when he applies himself. Mason watched her move around the kitchen, her presence now so natural in spaces that had once echoed with his solitude. You've made a difference already. It's early days yet, she demurred, but pleasure at the compliment colored her cheeks. Their evenings had developed a comfortable pattern. After supper, they might play chess or read aloud to each other from one of the books Cora had ordered from back east. Sometimes they simply talked, sharing thoughts and memories in the quiet hours before retiring to their separate rooms. Yet beneath this comfortable routine, something deeper was growing. Mason found himself looking for excuses to be near her, to hear her laugh, to see the way her eyes lit up when discussing a book she loved or a student who'd made progress. The practical arrangement they'd agreed upon was becoming increasingly personal, at least for him. One morning in early April, Mason rode into town to collect supplies and mail. Among the letters waiting at the general store was one addressed to Cora, bearing an Illinois postmark. Mason tucked it into his pocket without much thought, completing his errands before heading home. He found Cora in the garden behind the house, tilling soil for spring planting. She tied her hair back with a scarf, and smudges of dirt marked her cheeks and forehead. To Mason, she'd never looked more appealing. "Mail for you," he called, dismounting from his horse. "From Illinois." Cora straightened, wiping her hands on her apron as she took the letter. Her expression shifted from curiosity to concern as she studied the handwriting. "Is everything all right?" Mason asked, noticing her reaction. "Yes," she said quickly, tucking the unopened letter into her pocket. "Just unexpected. Thank you for bringing it." That evening, Cora was unusually quiet during supper, her mind clearly elsewhere. After they'd eaten, she excused herself early, retreating to her room with the still unopened letter. Mason remained at the table, a nagging worry taking root in his mind. Who would write to her from Illinois? Family, perhaps, but she'd said her brothers were scattered. A friend. Or something more troubling. He was still sitting there when Cora emerged an hour later, her face pale but composed. Without a word, she handed him the opened letter. "You should read this," she said quietly. Mason accepted the paper, a single sheet covered in bold, slanting handwriting. "My dearest Cora, you thought you could disappear, but you should know by now that what belongs to me I find. It took time and money, but I've traced your path west. Missouri, Kansas, now Wyoming territory, I'm told. A teacher again, playing at respectability while running from your promises. Did you think I would forget? That I would simply accept your betrayal? A Blackburn never forgets, my dear, and never forgives. We'll be seeing each other soon. Make your peace with that. Yours always." Edward Mason read the letter twice, anger building with each word. The possessiveness, the thinly veiled threat, the absolute certainty that Cora was somehow this man's property to reclaim it stirred a protective fury in him he hadn't felt since the war. "How did he find you?" he asked, setting the letter down carefully as if it might contaminate his home. Cora sank into the chair opposite him. "I don't know. Perhaps he followed the trail of teaching positions, or maybe someone from back home told him I'd headed west." She pressed her fingers to her temples. "I was foolish to think I could simply outrun him." "You're not going anywhere," Mason said firmly. "This is your home now. You're my wife in the eyes of the law and the community. He has no claim on you." "You don't understand Edward," Cora replied, fear evident in her voice. "He doesn't accept being denied what he believes is his." Mason reached across the table, covering her hand with his. "Then he'll have to learn. You're not alone in this anymore, Cora." She turned her hand to grip his, a gesture of trust that moved him deeply. "I've brought danger to your door," she said. "I never wanted that." "It was my choice," Mason reminded her gently, "and I'd make it again." That night, after Cora had retired to her room, Mason cleaned and checked his rifle and revolver. He hadn't fought in years, had built his life around creating rather than destroying, but he remembered how. If Edward Blackburn came to his ranch, came for his wife, he would find more resistance than he bargained for. The following days passed in a state of heightened vigilance. Mason adjusted his routines, never going far from the house, always keeping his revolver within reach. He spoke with Sheriff Wilson in confidence, explaining the situation without revealing the original nature of his and Cora's arrangement. "I'll keep an eye out for strangers in town," the sheriff promised. "This Blackburn shows his face in Wheatland, I'll know." Despite the threat hanging over them, daily life continued. Cora insisted on teaching her classes, refusing to allow fear to disrupt the education of her students. Mason accompanied her to and from town on teaching days, unwilling to let her travel alone. The shared danger created a new intimacy between them, breaking down some of the careful boundaries they'd maintained. One evening, as they sat by the fire after supper, Cora spoke of her engagement to Blackburn in more detail, how his charm had gradually given way to control, how she'd ignored warning signs until it was nearly too late. "I believed I could help him change," she admitted, gazing into the flames. "That my love would be enough to turn him from his darker nature. It's a common delusion, I suppose." "You can't change someone who doesn't want to change," Mason offered quietly. Cora looked at him, her expression softening. "No, but sometimes people change each other without even trying." She hesitated, then added, "You've changed me, Mason, made me braver, shown me what a true partnership could be." The words hung between them, loaded with unspoken meaning. Mason felt the shift in the air, the moment expanding with possibility. "Cora," he began, his voice rougher than he intended. "I need to tell you something." Before he could continue, a sound outside caught their attention, the distant approach of horses, moving fast in the gathering darkness. Mason was on his feet instantly, reaching for his rifle. "Stay inside," he instructed Cora, moving to the window. Through the glass, he could make out 3 riders approaching the ranch house, their forms dark against the twilight landscape. "Is it them?" Cora asked, fear evident in her voice. "Can't tell yet," Mason replied. "But 3 riders coming fast at dusk, it's not likely to be friendly neighbors." He positioned himself by the door, rifle ready. "Stay away from the windows. If shooting starts, go to the back bedroom and stay low." Cora nodded, her face pale but determined. She moved to the kitchen, returning with a loaded shotgun Mason kept for predators. "I won't hide if you're in danger," she said simply, taking up position on the other side of the main room. The riders pulled up in the yard, their horses' breath visible in the cool evening air. Mason peered carefully through the window, assessing the threat. 3 men dismounted, moving with the confidence of those unused to being refused. The leader, a tall figure in an expensive coat, stepped forward. "Cora," he called, his voice carrying clearly through the spring air. "I know you're in there. Come out and speak to me like a civilized person." Mason glanced at Cora, who had gone even paler at the sound of the voice. "Edward," she confirmed in a whisper. "Mrs. Northrop isn't receiving visitors," Mason called through the closed door. "Especially not after dark. State your business and be on your way." A laugh, cold and dismissive, filtered through the wood. "Mrs. Northrop, is it? How convenient. Tell me, does your husband know he's married to a woman who's already promised to another?" "I never promised to marry you after I learned what you really are," Cora called back, her voice steadier than Mason had expected. "Brave words from behind a locked door," Blackburn responded. "Come out, Cora. We have unfinished business, you and I." Mason positioned himself more firmly in front of the door. "The only business my wife has with you is concluded. Mount up and ride away while you still can." A moment of silence followed, then the sound of hushed conference among the three men outside. Mason used the opportunity to check his rifle one final time. "I tried to be reasonable," Blackburn called finally. "Remember that." The first shot shattered the front window, sending glass spraying across the room. Mason dropped to one knee, returning fire through the broken pane. Cora crouched behind a heavy oak cabinet, the shotgun steady in her hands. "Get to the back room," Mason shouted over the noise of gunfire. "I'm not leaving you," Cora insisted, her face set with determination. Outside, the three men had taken cover behind the water trough and wagon, firing sporadically at the house. Mason picked his shots carefully, aware of his limited ammunition and the need to conserve it. "We can wait all night, Northrop," Blackburn called during a lull in the shooting. "But this ends with Cora coming with me. Save yourself some trouble and send her out now." "Not a chance in hell," Mason muttered, lining up another shot. He fired, satisfaction coursing through him as one of Blackburn's companions cried out, clutching his shoulder. The exchange of gunfire continued for what felt like hours but was likely only minutes. Mason maintained his position by the window, aware of Cora moving carefully around the room behind him, her shotgun ready. Then, during a momentary pause, came the unmistakable smell of smoke. Mason risked a glance outside and saw flames beginning to lick at the side of the barn. "They've set fire to the barn," he reported grimly. "Trying to draw us out." Cora's face contorted with worry. "The animals, I know," Mason cut her off, already calculating options. The horses and cattle in the barn would die if the fire took hold, but stepping outside would make them easy targets. The sound of approaching hoofbeats provided unexpected resolution to their dilemma. Through the broken window, Mason could see riders approaching from the direction of town, the sheriff and several deputies, alerted perhaps by the gunfire or a neighbor who'd seen the strangers passing. "It's the sheriff," Mason called to Cora, "and he's brought help." Outside, the dynamics shifted rapidly. Blackburn and his remaining able-bodied companion found themselves caught between the house and the approaching lawmen. They fired a few desperate shots before mounting their horses, dragging their wounded companion with them. "This isn't over." Blackburn shouted toward the house as they galloped away, taking a different direction than the approaching sheriff. Mason burst from the house, rifle in hand, shouting to the sheriff. "They're headed east, and they've set fire to my barn." What followed was organized chaos. The sheriff sent 2 deputies after the fleeing men, while he and the others helped Mason and Cora form a bucket line from the well to the barn. The fire, caught early, was extinguished before it could do major damage, though one wall of the structure was badly charred. "You two all right?" Sheriff Wilson asked, once the immediate danger had passed. His keen eyes took in the broken window of the house, the bullet holes in the door frame. "We're unharmed," Mason confirmed, his arm instinctively going around Cora's shoulders. She leaned into him, exhaustion evident in every line of her body. "That was Blackburn?" the sheriff asked, looking to Cora for confirmation. She nodded. "Edward Blackburn and his brothers, I assume." "We'll find them," Wilson promised. Wyoming territory isn't kind to men on the run, especially not with a posse on their trail. After the sheriff and his men departed, Mason and Cora returned to their damaged home. Glass crunched beneath their boots as they surveyed the destruction-broken windows, splintered furniture, bullet holes in walls they'd painted together. "I'm so sorry," Cora said, her voice thick with emotion. "All of this because of me." Mason turned to her, taking both her hands in his. "No. All of this because of him, a man who believes he can own another person." He squeezed her hands gently. "This is our home, Cora. We'll rebuild what's broken." She looked up at him, tears gathering in her eyes. "Why did you do it, Mason? Taking a stranger, marry her, risk your life defending her?" "I've brought you nothing but trouble." Mason considered her question seriously, knowing she deserved an honest answer. "At first, it was simply the right thing to do," he admitted, offering shelter, protection. "But now—" He paused, gathering courage for words he'd held back too long. "Now I would do it all again because somewhere along the way I fell in love with you." Cora's breath caught audibly. "Mason, you don't need to say anything," he assured her quickly. "I understand our arrangement." "No," she interrupted, stepping closer to him. "You don't understand at all." Her hands moved to frame his face, her touch achingly gentle. "I've been falling in love with you since that first chess game, maybe even before, when you found me half frozen in your barn and carried me through a blizzard." The admission stunned Mason into momentary silence. Then, slowly, he bent his head until his forehead rested against hers. "I never expected this," he confessed softly. "Never thought I'd find someone who would make me feel this way again." "Again?" Cora questioned, her thumbs tracing the line of his jaw. Mason nodded slightly. "There was a girl before the war. We were young, had plans. She didn't wait." Understanding softened Cora's expression. "And you've been alone since." "Until now," Mason amended, his hands settling at her waist, drawing her closer. "Until you." The kiss that followed was nothing like the brief, formal one they'd shared at their wedding. This was revelation and promise combined, deep and searching. When they finally parted, both slightly breathless, the broken glass and bullet holes seemed insignificant compared to what had been built between them. "We should board up that window," Mason said eventually, though he made no move to release her. Cora smiled, her face illuminated with a joy that transcended the night's violence. "In a minute," she agreed, drawing his lips back to hers. That night, for the first time, they shared a bed not out of passion, though that simmered between them, but from a need to remain close, to affirm life in the face of those who had threatened it. They lay together in Mason's room, her head on his chest, his arms secure around her shoulders, talking quietly until sleep claimed them both. 2 days later, word came from the sheriff. Blackburn and one brother had been captured attempting to cross into Colorado territory. The third brother, more severely wounded than they'd initially thought, had died of his injuries before they could reach a doctor. "They'll stand trial in Cheyenne," Sheriff Wilson informed them, standing in their newly repaired front room. "Bank robbery, arson, attempted murder, they'll be looking at substantial prison time." Relief washed over Cora's face. "It's really over," the sheriff nodded. "You'll need to testify, both of you, but yes, madam, I believe it's over." After he'd gone, Mason found Cora in the garden, kneeling among the early spring plantings, her hands working the soil with practiced movements. He watched her for a moment, struck by how perfectly she fit into the landscape of his life, as if she'd always been meant to be there. "Sheriff's gone," he said, joining her in the garden. "How are you feeling?" Cora sat back on her heels, looking up at him with clear eyes. "Free," she said simply. "For the first time in years, completely free." Mason offered his hand, helping her to her feet. "What will you do with your freedom, Mrs. Northrop?" She brushed soil from her skirt, considering the question. "Teach my students, Plant this garden, build a life here. Her gaze met his, steady and sure. With you, if that's still what you want. It's all I want, Mason assured her, drawing her into his arms. The scent of earth and spring surrounded them, promise in every breath. That evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sun set over the distant mountains, Cora turned to Mason with thoughtful expression. "I've been thinking about the spare room," she said. Mason raised an eyebrow, curious about the sudden change of topic. "What about it? It might make a nice nursery," Cora suggested, her cheeks coloring slightly. Eventually. Understanding dawned on Mason's face, followed by a smile that transformed his weather-worn features. "Eventually," he agreed, taking her hand in his. "Or perhaps sooner." Cora's answering smile held all the warmth he'd ever dreamed of finding. "I'd like that," she said softly. As darkness settled over the ranch, they remained on the porch, planning their future in quiet voices. The stars emerged one by one above them, witnesses to the remarkable transformation that had begun on a bitter winter night when a cowboy found a woman sleeping in his barn, and, in sheltering her from the storm, discovered the very thing he hadn't known he was seeking. 1 year later, Mason stood in the doorway of the nursery formerly the spare room, watching as Cora rocked their infant son to sleep. The boy, just 3 months old, had his father's strong chin and his mother's clear eyes, a perfect blending of them both. "Is he asleep?" Mason whispered, crossing the room to stand beside the rocking chair. Cora nodded, gazing down at the peaceful face of little Thomas, named for the sheriff who had helped bring them safely through their darkest hour. "Finally," she murmured. "He fights sleep like it's his sworn enemy." "Strong-willed," Mason observed proudly. "Like his mother." Cora smiled up at her husband, the love between them having deepened over the months since they'd acknowledged it. "And stubborn, like his father." Carefully, she transferred the sleeping infant to his cradle, tucking a small quilt around him. Mason wrapped an arm around her waist as they stood watching their son's even breathing. "Did you finish the letter to the school board?" Mason asked quietly as they slipped from the nursery. Cora nodded, leading the way to the main room where a fire crackled in the hearth against the autumn chill. "Yes, explaining that I'll return to teaching next fall after Thomas is a bit older." She settled onto the sofa, patting the space beside her in invitation. "They're not pleased, but they understand." Mason joined her, his arm automatically extending along the back of the sofa. She nestled against his side, her head finding the familiar hollow of his shoulder. "I received a letter from my brother Michael today," Cora mentioned, her voice warm with pleasure. "He's finished his business in California and plans to visit in the spring. Says he's eager to meet his nephew and the man who finally managed to tie down his independent sister." Mason chuckled. "I look forward to meeting him. Families should know each other." Cora was silent for a moment, then said softly, "You're my family, Mason. You and Thomas. The family I chose." The simple declaration touched something deep in Mason's heart. He turned to face her fully, cupping her cheek with his calloused palm. "Best choice I ever made," he said, "finding you in that barn." "You didn't find me," Cora corrected, her eyes dancing with gentle teasing. "I found you. Your barn was simply convenient shelter." Mason leaned forward, pressing a gentle kiss to her lips. "Then I'm grateful for blizzards and convenient shelters." Outside, the Wyoming wind whistled around the corners of their home, carrying the first hints of winter. But within the walls they'd built and repaired together, warmth and love prevailed, a testament to the unexpected journey that had begun on a snowy night when kindness offered sanctuary, and sanctuary bloomed into love. As the fire burned low and the hour grew late, Mason and Cora moved together to their bedroom, hands linked, steps synchronized by months of shared life. Their conversation continued in hushed tones, making plans for spring planting, discussing the possibility of expanding the ranch, dreaming of the future they would build together. And in the nursery, little Thomas Northrop slept peacefully, secure in the knowledge even at his tender age that he was surrounded by love that had been forged in adversity and tempered by choice, growing stronger with each passing season. Mason Northrop, once solitary by nature and circumstance, now fell asleep each night with his wife in his arms and his son nearby, marveling at how completely his life had been transformed by the woman he'd found seeking shelter from a storm. And Cora, who had once run in fear across half a continent, now rested securely in the home and the heart she'd claimed as her own, no longer running, but finally, irrevocably, home.